Warning: the following broadcast is not approved by your teacher, university, politician, or government. Side effects may include skepticism, better reasoning skills, liberty, peace, and an escape from the woke.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to a new episode of the Been Awake podcast for better sense making. I am your host, LB Muniz. Welcome to the show. This is going to be a shorter episode. I hope you guys enjoy it. We're going to be talking about a piece that I recently published at beenawake.com. This why I didn't call my Substack, my Twitter, this podcast, why it's not anti-woke. It's an important conversation. It's a quick conversation, but it's an important conversation about how we position ourselves when we are thinking about who we are, what our society is, where things are going, and who we oppose. Now, obviously, if you've listened to the show for any period of time, you know that I'll talk about the woke. I'll talk about these people that push certain ideas on society and who progress in ideology, a way of thinking, a philosophy, if we can call it that I don't necessarily agree with. By the way, if you are watching the video, yes, I am recording this in my car, parked in a parking lot at the moment. But anyway, let's get right into it. Let's cover the piece. With everything I write, if you guys don't know this, I try to layer things that aren't necessarily evident unless you pay attention to the body of work that I produce here at beenawake.com. But there's subtext, there's things that I don't necessarily want to expound upon within a piece, because then suddenly everything is over 1,000 words. It's not anything that people are going to read. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy doing the podcast, because it gives me that time to be able to explore things in a little more detail. So there's something to be said. This is how I start the piece. So I would start a lot of things. There's something to be said for simple messaging. After all, the easier it is for people to understand what your thing is, the easier time they will have of clicking that ever sought after follow button. In politics, I'm fond of saying, in politics, the moral edge goes to whatever side you already agree with. So let's pause and let's talk about what that means. We, broadly speaking, if you're watching this video in the time that it's produced, we all grow up within a largely democratic system. Certainly, I'm talking, certainly for an American audience, this is the case. We live in this crazy mass democracy that produces all kinds of interesting and crazy ideas. We live under a liberal democracy, and so there's all these different words that we use to describe the system that we live in, and we can unpack those in various regards. But as a practical matter, after a lot of fighting with myself, fighting with other people, having conversations like these, one thing became apparent to me. When it comes to politics, the moral edge, so the side that you think is more moral, the side that you think has the right idea about a situation, that's going to go to the side that you already agree with. It's going to go to the side that you think is already correct. It is and so you can understand from that, if somebody disagrees with you politically, let's speaking, whether it's a matter of policy or a matter of deeper morality, as we'll get into later, there is, without a doubt, you're predisposed to agree with one side versus another. So this should affect the way that we bring our messaging. Now, in general, my content, while I'm very appreciative when people say that it tends to be very reasoned and it tends to be very measured, and certainly I try to take that tone when I write and when I speak. That's not to pretend that my content isn't without bias, right? I approach things explicitly from what I would call a right-wing bias, and we're going to get in a little bit to what that means as we read the piece. So it's something that we should remember. It's something that we should remember when we watch the talking heads on cable news, when we see people fighting on Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, wherever. The moral edge in politics goes to the side that you already agree with. That's one of the reasons why it's so important and why so much effort is given reaching out to younger people. I would argue there's only a few times in everyone's life where you're really ready for any kind of paradigm shift. And I think for the vast majority of people, even if you're ready for it, if ideas don't take you in those moments, you're just going to stay with whatever you believed beforehand. This is basic human nature. It costs a lot of resources. It takes a lot of mental faculties to do what I do, which is consistently, or to the extent that I can, consistently apply a principle of skepticism to ideas. And it takes a lot to try and rethink and reform a worldview once it's been set. That's one of the things about a worldview, and I'm using this in a nebulous term on purpose. That's one thing about a worldview, is that it's already there to give you the answers. So it should follow from that. If you want to take the philosophical journey, it should follow from that you should choose very carefully the worldview that you adopt for yourself. And certainly, if you've been following this podcast, this page for any length of time, you would understand that this has been something that I've been doing, is reworking my own worldview in real time. Because I think for a lot of us, one of those times where our thoughts and reality came crashing into one was in 2020, and that's around the time that I started this project. So in politics, the moral edge goes to the side you already agree with. Growing up, I think you're given a false sense of the degree to which you make your own decisions. Growing up, you're given a false sense of the degree to which you make your own decisions. This links to what I was just discussing. Let's get into the subtext. We're taught in our modern liberal democracies that that you get to decide who you are and what you want to be in this world. And if you're somebody who pays attention to things the way that I am, and the way that you are, dear listener, dear reader, is you kind of realize that that's not actually what happens. Turns out, if you come from a family of doctors, you're probably going to end up as a doctor, or maybe in the medical field. If you come from a family of lawyers, the same thing. You're already predisposed in many regards, both genetically and environmentally, towards certain professions, towards certain fields. And of course, there are many fields that have a certain barrier to entry, given the level of education you have to receive, the level of acuity you need to have in a particular topic or subject. And so while for many people, like, I can remember when I was in my early 20s, right? And, going to college and stuff, I met a lot of people who wanted to be a doctor. I met a lot of people who wanted to be a lawyer. Heck, I was one of those people that thought about being a lawyer. And that's all well and good. And I'm not saying that I couldn't have been a lawyer, but it just ended up not being my path. In fact, I ended up in sales, which, lo and behold, that's what most of my family is in. Now, maybe there's other ancillary things you can say, oh, you're always in sales, but that's my career. I do a little bit of marketing. I love doing this show, but what drives me, what pays my bills, what funds my podcasting endeavors is not just the words that I write, but also my ability to sell the product that I'm paid to sell. So I think we're given a false sense to the degree to which any of us make our own decisions. I think there's a lot of things that are made for us from the time we're born, from the family that we're born into, to the place that we're raised, certainly the time in which we're raised, all of these different things. And so I think it's a mistake, and this is one of the cultural battles we see happening right now. I think it's a mistake to think too much that we can be anything that we want to be. You can be a lot of things. You can, in fact, in many cases, you can rise above perhaps even where what your forebears achieved. But I think that's rarer than you might think. Going back to what I was saying before, I met a lot of people who at 18 wanted to be a doctor, and by 2021, they were in a completely different field because they couldn't, it just wasn't the path for them. By the way, I also know a few of those people who ended up being doctors. So obviously, it's not impossible. Despite protestations, many of which I've made countless time and again, even at the beginning of this project, if you go back and look at the archives, you can see this. I think in politics, things come down to three options. You can choose the left, you can choose the right, or you can abstain in one form or another, right? You can say, I'm not going to go with either side. Are there subdivisions within each of these choices? Absolutely, there are subdivisions here. Does that change how the vast majority of people operate? I don't think so. Not really. Applying the cultural lens, what do I mean by cultural lens? So By culture, I mean the rites, practices, and rituals of a given set of people, right? Culture isn't just one thing. If you take a look at a map and look at human history, that's pretty obvious that there have been multiple cultures that have existed at different times. And within those cultures, there are subcultures that then come together to form larger cultures. I can give a larger scheme of culture, but for the purposes of our conversation, that's all that I need to say. And when I say applying the cultural lens, I think there's a few different lenses we can apply to any problem. And the degree to which we can get all three of those lenses to line up, three that I'll name here briefly, I think we get a better sense of what many people would call the truth. So I think there's the cultural lens, which deals with the practices and rituals of people. I think there's the material lens, which deals with fields like economics and, literally the material concerns. So physical things in the world, things that are easily observable, things that you can, and things that can be seen. Right. And then there's context that you apply to that. There's ways of interpreting that we all do. And finally, I think there's a spiritual lens. A lot of people will say that we're in the midst of some kind of spiritual war, and I think there's a degree to that. People will think we're in a cultural war, and I think there's a lot to do with that. Clearly, we're in material wars because there are wars happening all over the world right now, both kinetic wars as we think of men on a battlefield shooting at each other, but then also wars that we fight in business, let's say, or within our own families. And so I think those lenses, the material, the spiritual, and the cultural, to the degree we can apply any of that to a situation, we can gain a better understanding. But applying the cultural lens, and I'll maybe expound upon that here in a second, but let's read this. Applying the cultural lens, the left is best defined as maximal egalitarianism and maximal liberation. I've taken this definition from Charles Haywood of the Worthy House because it's the best one I've come across by far. And just doing a quick check to make sure that we are, yes, using the right microphone. That would suck if I recorded all this and then I didn't have the nice audio you've come to expect. So maximal egalitarianism and maximal liberation. It is belief without limit. And I've talked about this in other episodes, so you can go back and kind of get a sense of what I mean here. But by limit, I literally mean that. If you're watching the video, right, there's a limit here to where my screen is. It's kind of inside of the larger screen because, my car background is ugly. So I wanted to have the little bit of the nice screen that I'm accustomed to using at home in the background. So there's a limit to this screen. There's a limit to the device that you're watching on. It has edges and curves. Leftism, understood properly, understood in the best way that we can understand it, is belief without limit. So it is literally the thought that you can do anything. Of course, some of the most famous leftists of the 20th century, the communists and the socialists, they believed, there's one famous socialist communist thinker who said, man will be a fisherman in the morning, a poet in the evening, and a philosopher at night. Something, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the idea. They literally have what's called what Thomas Sowell would call an unconstrained view of humanity. So the thought is that it's actually our environment, including our society, that limit us as people, not limits that we have born unto us as fallen creatures. The right, by contrast, is any set of beliefs which opposes this. This is to say, it is the belief that there are differences. So that is to say, there is a belief in hierarchy and that there are duties to our existence, that we have obligations. Those who abstain will fall temperamentally into one of the two categories. I think this is an important thing to note. Is that, even if you're somebody who says there's a third way or a better way of politics, chances are there's a predominating school of thought that you agree with, even if you don't agree with everything they say, because you've carved out a nice little niche for yourself. So even if you're in one of these forms of abstention, you're going to fall temperamentally into one of these other categories. What do I mean by temperamentally? Well, that would be like a material thing, right? That would be a material thing. It's like kind of who you are as a person. So for example, if you're a very open person and you're very creative, you're probably, in many cases, not all cases, because I think of myself as an open person, you're somebody who would maybe fall more temperamentally into a left-wing paradigm because you do see the way in which barriers can be broken and edges can be blurred. Whereas if you're somebody very low in openness, by contrast, you would be like, well, no, this is exactly the way the world is because this is the way I understand it. And that's baked into who you are as a person in both cases. Neither is wrong, neither is right per se. Right? It's that there are two different, fundamentally different ways of looking at the same problem. That presents a greater problem when we're talking about how do you run a society with hundreds of millions of people. But let's stay on topic. So what would be, let's take these left and right. What would be, we talked about the cultural lens. I'll briefly kind of give you an idea of what the material lens would be manifested in major political parties, certainly in our forms of democracy that we live under today. So in terms of the United States, it's the Republicans and Democrats. And I'll get into a little bit of why, yes, that gets messy, but it doesn't change that for the vast majority of people, this is how they perceive the world. And in terms of the spiritual, I think it's chaos and order, right? So the left is chaos, the right is order. And I think that's more of a spiritual analysis than it is a cultural or a material one. Now, you might notice that they all kind of line up. And therein is my point, that to the degree we can get all these things to align, we have a better understanding of the way things are. So those who abstain will fall temperamentally into one of the two categories for a variety of reasons. Some have decided to remove themselves from political questions or advocate for another way in politics. But like neutrons in an atom, they affect peripheral properties without changing the substance. Now, my physics definition might not be exactly correct, but I think for a 101 understanding, it is. Choosing the left, I go on to say, choosing the left or choosing the right in America should not be confused with support for a major political party. While most will coalesce into these democratic vehicles, individual perspectives will vary on how to classify a given politician. You may not like a politician, but that doesn't absolve you from a designation. Right. So the far left socialist types will look at a Joe Biden and they'll say, well, he's a corporatist. He's not me, but I'm of the left and he's to the right. Well, that's actually a relational argument because it's just a matter of where you are versus where he is. I think to the degree we do zoom out, it can still be said that he is of the left, if for no other reason than he tends to sow chaos. When I started this project almost 4 years ago, I was a member of the abstention category. I advocated heavily for broadly libertarian ideas, and despite overwhelming evidence, advocated for support of third parties as a vehicle for change. Despite this, I was and remain a member of the right, even if I didn't admit it to myself. I think in particular, because of the way that because of the schooling system that we come up in, is we're very, and I guess because of liberalism broadly, we're very adverse as Americans to talk about ourselves as members of the right. Why? Because the boogeyman Hitler was of the right, of course. And so it's not to say that I'm like Hitler, but it is to say that these contextual definitions require a grounding in order to understand them. It's one of the reasons why we have to apply different modes of analysis and come up with better answers, is because we're presented with this binary that is in and of itself false. But so for a long time, I certainly wasn't a progressive. I certainly wasn't a communist. That's at the very core of who I am as a person. So I found myself in libertarian circles. And for a time, I thought maybe libertarian politics, third-party politics, was a way forward. And I don't believe that anymore. And in part, this is because, like I said, temperamentally speaking, I was somebody of the right. I believe in order. I don't believe in causing chaos for no reason, for the sake of it, for the sake of the fact that this has been the way it is, and I'm now going to change it, has never been enough of a reason for me. There's nuance here, of course. Influenced heavily by my family's escape, and not my direct family, but my ancestors' escape from communism, which was the most material and devastating representation of leftist ideology. That's one of the reasons why I consider myself of the right. If I had a different temperament, I would have called this Substack and my publication Anti-Woke or End Wokeness. I would have reached for the lowest fruit and let the dopamine drip of easy likes surge through my veins, but that is not my path. That's not what I set out to do with this. perhaps if I was a little more savvy in college, I might have angled my way into some kind of a staff writing position at a publication, and maybe this would have been in part my path. But I think that's also one of the reasons why I never went that direction, is because I never liked that. There was always something so phony about it. And one thing that I'll remark, I posted this on X recently, is like, a lot of talk outside of the Beltway, outside of mainstream sources, is like how awful corporate journalism is. And I would agree with that. I think most journalists are so unworthy of the name that I've had to create an entire new category of sense making to describe what it is I do. Right, which is commentary infused with philosophy, infused with reporting, and infused of what would have been called journalism at one point in time. So, despite all this, a lot of people will bemoan what a journalist is and say that journalism is dead and all these things. And yet, in this new ecosystem that Elon Musk has largely created by himself, but a lot of it existed beforehand, what I've noticed is that a lot of these journalists, including pages like End Wokeness and so on, will still always go for the lowest hanging fruit. Now, is there a place for this? I suppose so. But gosh, I think there's a line that a lot of people cross, a lot of creators cross. In many respects, perhaps because it is their livelihood, and when your bottom line is dependent upon likes, you're going to make sure you post whatever you can to get people to like it. But gosh, they cross the line sometimes, doing exactly what every local news station does, which is taking the worst headline and blasting it across all of your platforms. After all, if it bleeds, it leads. That's not the path I wanted to take with this project, even if I will cover current events. So what is the mission? The mission of this project is better sense making. And more often than not, that means counter-signaling commonly held tropes to bring the willing participant, which you are by listening to this, to a higher level of understanding. It means I don't act like a stuffy professor in an ivory tower or a sophist engaged in clever rhetoric. While I'm capable of both, neither fulfills the mission of actually helping someone have a better grasp on reality. The mantra of TV news, as I had already said, is that if it bleeds, it leads. Sensational stories capture people's attention, and the pithy responses or mundane observations clothed in flowery language make the herd of humanity nod in agreement. Yep, that's right. Man, it's just because kids today don't want to work. That's why things aren't going the way we want it to. It's because kids today are lazy. If you can go back like 100 years and people were saying that. Nuance is a choice, and it comes with its own perils. I'll admit that firsthand. But simplicity, I believe, is a luxury for the plebs. If you take for granted that an elite will always exist, then it follows those people and or their advisors should be capable of more than just saying sound bites. The purpose of Been Awake is to fill that role, to examine with detachment while never straying from eternal principles. So thank you for being a member of that mission. And if you like today's episode, do me a favor, go to beenawake.com/subscribe, or go to beenawake.com to subscribe. Follow me on all social media at the LB Muniz, and we'll be right back here for another episode real soon.
If you like what you heard today, go to beenawake.com to subscribe for future updates. My name is LB Muniz, and I am not one with the woke.